Bruce, and thank you for inviting me here today. Well, we're in the middle of an unprecedented commodity boom in Australia, with more to come. And the question is, how relevant is our ambition to become an innovative, knowledge-based economy? Rowett put an absolutely superb global context on this. Here in Australia, our Australian Treasurer has also set out the challenge in a very compelling way. Our core task is to rebalance our economy. We need to leverage the boom to build a broader, high-tech, low-pollution economy with education as the principal driver of prosperity. That means building productivity. Now, what's the importance of productivity during a commodity boom? The importance is that the commodity boom has driven our terms of trade and our exchange rate higher than it's ever been. In that context, in order to rebalance and to diversify our economy, our trade-exposed industries need to be competitive. And besides which, we know booms come to an end. And in Australia, when they do, they come to end, they end badly. And in that context, if we end up with a diversified economy, we're much more able to deal with the pressures of international competition than if we've put all our eggs in one basket. It's absolute common sense, but joining up policy to common sense is a much bigger challenge. And it is a very big challenge when we have the current situation in Australia where behind the boom we've seen a structural deterioration in our productivity performance over the last 10 years. The 1990s, as you can just about see at the end of the table there, we experienced labour productivity growth well above the OECD average following the microeconomic reforms of the early 1990s. In the early 2000s, we started scraping along the bottom, and indeed in this last year, productivity growth actually went backwards in Australia. Now, that doesn't really matter when we're feeling so rich, but when we're thinking about our trade-exposed sectors, how we're going to build up our competitiveness and how we're going to diversify our economy in the years ahead, it's a very big issue. And it's an issue that was addressed by the federal government initially in a review some years ago of the national innovation system, innovation being absolutely key to the development of productivity growth, both here and globally. And out of the many findings of this study, one of the most important was we don't actually have a system. The elements of innovation in Australia are not joined up. We don't have the system that many countries have, joining up public agencies with our research and education institutions, with our finance, and ultimately at the enterprise level where innovation gets traction. What is the importance of this in the context of our current discussion? Well, a response was provided by the government's white paper, Powering Ideas, in the context of the skills required to make innovation work. Few organisations command all the skills needed to innovate successfully on their own. They must network and collaborate locally and globally. And this is where the importance of our current topic becomes absolutely critical because, again, just as in the productivity chart, here is another OECD chart of intensity of collaboration performance in our competitor and comparable economies around the world. Australia, at this end of the table, has one of the worst records of collaboration both between companies and between companies on the one hand and our research and educational institutions. There is a disconnect in our system, both within Australia and globally, and a lot of that has to do with skill, it has to do with management, it has to do with connection. We undertook a study at UTS together with some other counterparts for the Department of Innovation federally a year or so ago, looking at Australian management performance on a series of benchmarks using a scoring grid across 16 countries, a study led by the London School of Economics using a methodology which I don't have time to go into here, but it looked at 18 characteristics of management. And of those 18 characteristics, there's a particular one here which you won't be able to see. I'll describe it to you in a moment, at which Australian managers do particularly poorly. The characteristics are divided between operations management, performance management, and people management. The top bar, the red bar, are the scores for global best practice across 16 countries, with, interestingly, the US and Sweden, two very different social systems, coming at the top of the table. We're about halfway down. In fact, the Minister had a difficult time announcing this report because Australian managers were not the worst, they weren't the best, they were about average. How do you turn that into a media release? Well, the media release read, well, we can't afford to be average. But in fact, in one area, we're so far below average that it is of great concern to all of us. And this is the area with the very big gap between the blue bar, which is where Australia is, and the top of the red bar. That category is called instilling a talent mindset, which we can see as a proxy for innovation in our organisations. Because although Tom Friedman wrote a book some time ago, The World is Flat, in which he portrayed an interconnected world, one in which all the barriers to movement had disappeared. In reality, as Richard Florida replied to him in an interesting article in the Atlantic Monthly, in fact, the world is spiky. The world is spiky because there are nodes of spikiness, of superior competitive advantage driven by knowledge and ingenuity. And it's those countries, those regions, those communities which can capture that talent advantage, which are the ones that are going to survive best in the 21st century, whether or not they're blessed with resources. Look at small countries which have done very well. Ireland not doing so well now, but not because of any failure in its technology and innovation policy, rather deregulation of its financial and property markets has brought the house down there, literally. But look at the other countries, Finland, Singapore, Taiwan, all on the periphery of large markets, all rebounding from the global recession. Finland, the fastest growing economy in Europe at the present time, all driven by knowledge and ingenuity and interconnection. Indeed, also regions in larger economies, Silicon Valley being the most obvious exemplar in ICT, but also the Carolinas, North and South Research Triangle, Austin, Texas, Massachusetts with its Wang economy, the computer hardware economy of the 1980s, first collapsing and then giving rise to the growth of biosciences. It's gone through several iterations of intensive cluster development, fueled by the connections between companies and their very fine university system. And in Europe as well, Silicon Fen around Cambridge, Munich, Grenoble, with its strong emphasis on microelectronics and part of the French government's emphasis on so-called competitiveness poles, Sophia Antipolis. And there are many others, both in Europe, in the US, and increasingly in the Asian region, all of which are based on cluster development and in particular on connection. This is a table which results from a survey research report by Cambridge University and MIT. And what this survey looked at among 3,500 companies in the UK and US, well, what were the optimal relationships between companies and universities? It hadn't really been, the question hadn't been asked of companies, what do you actually want from universities? It had been assumed that companies wanted universities to be more commercial, that maybe technology licensing and better arrangements to connect academics with industry that way would be the preferred method of collaboration. In fact, out of all the responses firms could have given, the one that came at the top was one that was included in the survey as a residual, and that's the one up there at the top, informal contacts. What does that mean? And then one or two categories down, conferences. Conferences and informal contacts taken together are the preferred method by companies of interacting with research and educational institutions. And how is that done? It's done through workshops, it's done through, indeed, through social media, it's done increasingly virtually, but also in reality, in the coffee shops in Palo Alto, in the science parks around Cambridge. It's not done very well in Australia, as we saw earlier. Our rate of and intensity of collaboration between companies and universities is very low. Where can that kind of activity take place? And what can we do as educators, and you do as those in the meeting, events and tourism industries, as well as in government, can contribute to improving this situation? Well, firstly, we have to get beyond the statistics. Let's look at the nature of our city. This is from a book in the 1970s, Soft City, a wonderful piece. Living in a city is an art. The city as we imagine it, the soft city of illusion, myth, aspiration, nightmare, is as real, maybe more real, than the hard city one can locate in maps and statistics. This sense of informality, of interaction, giving rise to ideas, giving rise to innovation, is something that is more of a challenge than the more structured relationships we've been used to in the past, and which we think other people can prescribe for us, but in fact they can't. This is the way of the future, and it's a way that we're pursuing. If I can give a shameless plug to our business school here, we're constructing just within a few hundred metres of this convention centre an extraordinary building designed by Frank Gehry, which will express this relationship in reality, not in statistics, but in the interactions that we intend between the educational institution and the world outside, in a porous building, as Frank Gehry describes it, one that focuses on interaction both among the disciplines and the students internally, but also in its relationship with business, with networks, with the world outside, and which will become a tourist attraction in its own right, in what will become an extraordinary, as it's been promised, Darling Harbour, South Darling Harbour redevelopment, in the midst of what is becoming a creative industries hub in this part of Sydney. Creative industries driven by the new industries, digital media, fashion and design, film and television, software development. The companies around here have household names, but there are also names that you will have never heard of, but which will be the next household names, driven not just by academics, not just by industry itself, but by our students working in innovation labs in a porous building with companies, and in the context, as we would hope, of meetings, events, networks, all of these becoming part of what in The Economist magazine last week were called open, dynamic and creative societies, created by the alchemy of artists, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, civic institutions and governments coming together in the right combination at the right moment. And for Australia, according to this very compelling Economist survey, I recommend everyone should read it, this is surely such a moment. So, where does that leave us in conclusion? It means that all of us have a role to play in this, not just government. We have to invest in Sydney and its creativity and innovation infrastructure and potential. The creative precinct around this part of Sydney and more broadly is both drives innovation and is an attractor of innovation. It drives meetings and collaborations, and it attracts meetings and collaborations, as set out so eloquently by Rowett earlier. It also requires us to invest in our own skills and capabilities. As we can see, we're falling short in many respects. Part of this is the responsibility of the education sector, but it's also the responsibility of business to interact more informally and more successfully with the education sector. And it also means investing in a very much more focused way in collaboration through meetings and events, through social media, through virtual exchange, but in a way that contributes to the role of Sydney and the role of Australia, in fact, as a focal point, not just for commodity production, which we're very good at and which we should keep doing, but also as a 21st century knowledge-based innovation economy. Thank you very much.